Hello everyone, welcome to another video. I'm Ribbert, this is one of my builds. I did some new opening titles. I think they're still a bit too fast. It was a lot of work. I just wanted to do some fancy glass kind of 3D thing. I don't know. Yeah, welcome to another video. This video's title is 5 tips for towns. So what am I gonna be talking about? Well, of course, towns. And when I talk about towns, I mean something that is like in between a village and a city in terms of population size. So it's bigger than just like a farming village, but it's not quite as big as a city or a metropolis. I guess a city would be like 30,000 people upwards, and the town would be like between 5 and 30,000, I don't know. So I have some tips for those of you who might be struggling with the early game, because I do think small cities or towns are pretty much early game. And so yeah, how to get set up. My first tip would be, and I think I'm gonna end up adding some in-screen, in-video text here. I'm not sure yet. First tip is be careful with how much infrastructure you build, because infrastructure costs money, and at the start of a town or even a city, whatever you're planning to do, you're gonna be struggling with your budget a bit. So don't plan too much ahead. Just get a couple of roads in, and that should be fine. So in the video, I'm actually building way too much roads and stuff. I'm not really too worried, because I tend to do all right at the start of towns. But if you're struggling with that, then my first suggestion would be careful about how much stuff you build before you even start growing citizens. And another tip would be that you could just start with streets. You don't need roads at the start of the game. Roads are more expensive to put down and more expensive to maintain. So just starting with some streets will help you save some money. Alright, so that's the first tip. Don't build too much infrastructure, especially rails and stuff. Rails and roads are pretty expensive. Avenues are insanely expensive. Just avoid avenues altogether. And yeah, don't be afraid to just bulldoze later on and just rebuild a whole neighborhood or whatever if you're not happy with it. You could, at the start, I think if you're playing the game for the game, then you should just try to save money as much as possible, so you can get some extra budget for your education and your healthcare services, so you can get some higher level wealth people in that make more money off of them. So at the start, just save as much money as you can on roads, use streets wherever you can, and just upgrade the streets whenever they are saying that there's traffic issues. And I would also suggest, because I'm playing of course with the network add-on mod, and if you don't have the network add-on mod, then I do think the game is ridiculously hard, because there's still some the capacity of the roads and stuff like that is a lot lower for non-network add-on mod. So vanilla, let's just call it vanilla. And that just means that you're gonna be running into traffic issues a lot more. So I would suggest you just get the network add-on mod, and maybe if you're having traffic issues, you could even consider changing the settings. I think there's a bunch of pre-made traffic settings that have different capacities for roads and stuff, but you can also go into, because the network adder mod comes with an editor, I believe, and you can just change the capacities there. So streets, not roads, let's just call it that. Alright, second tip: if you're trying to build a town, try to avoid grids. If you're trying to build a metropolis, then you should, of course, go with the grid. But even metropolises, I've been looking at some big cities around the world and looking at their layouts, and they're not as much of a grid as you would think. A lot of it is a grid, but there's like constant discontinuations of the grid, so there's still a lot of random stuff happening, even in New York or something like that. So yeah, I mean, grid cities can look interesting. Don't be afraid to build a grid city. But if you're trying to build a town, towns don't really tend to have that kind of planning yet. So I would avoid using a grid. And I just think it's more interesting to not have a big grid. And I think towns tend to just start with random people building like their own home somewhere. They just buy a bit of land, they hire an architect or maybe just a contractor, and then they just get building, and they just build whatever they want and wherever they can afford to, I guess. So if you're doing a grid, then you're basically, well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with grids. Let's just say that if you're new to the game, maybe building a grid is easier, but if you're trying to build a town and not just a big city, you should avoid the grid. Just start up with a couple of roads, 2 or 3 roads, and use wherever your first residents are as like a seed, and just let it gradually grow from there. So yeah, as you can see, what I did here is I basically built a road across the map, pretty much across the map, I think. And I also did a ton of railroad bullshit. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I've been struggling with this one for a bit now. So shouldn't have done that, but whatever. Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that I can fit some rail in here, because I think it would be realistic to have like an old 1800s kind of harbor with some kind of rail connection. But I ended up just, I think this is where I start with a better idea. So I was talking about grids. I mean, grids are fine, but I think it's more satisfying to build something that looks interesting and nice. So if you're looking to build an interesting and nice town, I think it's better to just avoid the grid at the start, and then use whatever random shapes you're creating, and just let them explode throughout your city. And don't be too limited by what you've built as well, because in real life there's like these old towns and stuff, and like in the 70s and 80s, they at least in the Netherlands, they had like a giant need for more housing, and they just ignored everything that was done with the old towns. They just built like big blocks of square grids, and some of them are more random grids. So the point I'm making is, if you're trying to start with a small town, or maybe even a bigger town. At the start, it just helps you get that towny feel if you start off with a less structured approach and just let it grow. Because, yeah, as I was trying to say, in real life, people just build their home. A town starts with just a bunch of random people finding a good location and then just starting to build their homes there. And I think if you can simulate that in a game like this, and I think the game does give you the tools to simulate that, and yeah, I think it's quite satisfying to just grow a small town and just have some random shapes, and then as you go, you start maybe applying some more gritty systems to some areas, and I don't know, it can give some pretty interesting results. So yeah, that's tip number 2. Try to avoid grids at the start. I'm still building railroads. Yeah. Next tip is one about saving money. I think. Oh, okay. The next tip is partially about saving money. It's mostly about saving money, I guess. Your citizens need power, so make sure you build power. I guess that's not really a good tip because everybody knows that, but what some people might forget is that you should just, when you go into a new town that you're planning to start, just pause the game, and once you've built your power, first go into your power budget and set it to like 30% or something like that. Don't let it run at full power, because you're just wasting money that way. No starting city needs that much power. I guess it depends. I guess if you're just building windmills, but windmills are super expensive, so just avoid windmills. And if you want to go green, I suggest you get like a mod like the geothermal power plant that I have here, which is a bit cheaty because it doesn't pollute and it provides power at like the rate of a coal power plant, I think, or maybe it's close to a gas power plant. But then the cost per power ratios in the game are pretty bad. Well, they're quite unrealistic compared to real life power plants. So basically the game makes you feel like coal power is practically free, and in real life it's actually more expensive than nuclear power. And I'm not sure, actually. I haven't really... Okay, I don't know exactly what it is in real life. Let's not start spreading information that is false. But I do know that the power to cost ratios in the game are not realistic. So feel free to just download a mod that makes the start easier for you. But yeah, I tend to avoid something that would like just give you free power. So I don't think the pollution mechanic is super interesting when it comes down to power and stuff like that. So I tend to just be okay with downloading a mod that gives you reasonably priced power without derping out your future city with pollution. So okay, so power, don't leave the budget all the way up. Another one is water, of course, because water is optional. First of all, water is completely optional at the start of the game. I did build water in this town when I started, because it's already connected to a bunch of other cities, so it's capable of growing larger buildings which do need water. So water is optional, But if you want to further develop your city, then it's not. So, and if you're doing water, just go with the water towers. You don't need a pump. A pumping station costs 8 times as much as a water tower at the start. It does give you a better ratio in terms of water per money, but at the start you don't need that much water, and you can just plop down some water towers until you have like 6 or 7 of them, and then whenever you need another one, just bulldoze all the water towers and go for a pumping station. And that way you just save some money at the start, and whenever you're making money, you can just put the game on high speed and build up a budget for your next expansion project. So I do suggest that at the start you if you're gonna go for water, you don't need to go for water. You can just avoid water, and you can actually make a pretty good amount of money that way. But if you do go for water, just start off with some water towers like I did, and then just go into pumping stations later on. Once you have one pumping station, I guess you can still do water towers in between, but once you've got like 2 pumping stations, then you should be making enough money that you can just afford the extra cost of the inefficiency of the pumping station. You can't really lower the budget for water because it also affects the pipes, which is more problematic than just it causes the pipes to break and stuff, and it can get really annoying. When you're building a water tower, by the way, don't build it next to your dirty industry or even your power plant if you're using a coal or any kind of dirty power plant. The game actually looks at the water pollution nearby the water towers and pumping stations as well. So you kind of want to avoid putting those anywhere where there's going to be pollution. So farming industry also tends to pollute a bunch. So pick a spot that's far from your industry stuff, but then a water tower also has a negative effect on the land desirability for residents. So I guess a water tower should be in a commercial area or a high-tech industry area. I actually end up building my second water tower in the middle of the industry. I didn't even think about that when I was playing it. I guess it's okay because it's high-tech industry, but I'm gonna need to keep an eye on the pollution over there later on. Okay, so that's it for power and water. The next one, which would be the 4th tip, is you don't need services at the start of a city or a town. When you're starting a town and you're just putting down some of your first residences, you don't need to start with schools, and you don't need to start with police, you don't need to start with fire department. You can just save money that way. It doesn't even pay off. I think schools and hospitals start to pay off whenever you have like a whole bunch of medium density stuff. But because you're gonna be starting with some pretty low density, generally speaking, in your town, you should avoid building services at the start. You don't need police at all. Police actually only becomes a thing whenever you have a bunch of crime, but at the start there's not going to be crime. I think crime might also be influenced by differences in education level or something like that. I don't know exactly, maybe just wealth levels. It would be realistic if a lot of difference in income would cause some crime to develop, but I'm not sure if the game is that realistic. But for services, yeah, just avoid them. You don't need them. Even parks, you don't need parks either. I guess you could call parks a kind of service. And public transit I also wouldn't do at the start of a city. Just yeah, you need a bunch of population in order for buses and stuff like that to pay for themselves. At some point they can pay for themselves, and then it's just stupid to not use them. I guess the downside of buses is that it might be annoying to plan for them, because they need like that extra spot every time. But then you can use road top mass transit, I believe it's called. It's a mod that allows you to put the bus stops in the streets and roads. I'm not sure. I think that derps out with residential though, so I don't know. Just figure it out, I guess. Yeah, so no services, no parks. You don't need parks anyway. Parks just attract high wealth Sims at the start, but then they can't find jobs. And actually, whenever you put down a park, its influence of positive, it's a park effect, I believe, and the same goes for plazas, of course. The effect that they have initially is stronger than it is over time. It fades away a bit. So whenever you put down a park, the new residents think like, whoa, this is a really nice place. And then after like a year or so, it's faded a bit. It's not really fading, but it spreads out slowly. So at the start, the influence is really centered around the park, and then later on it goes, yeah, it spreads out, so it goes into a wider radius, but it also gets less intense across that radius. So at the start, the new people moving in, the new people moving in think, whoa, this is a really nice area. And rich people actually sometimes move in whenever you start with some parks. And then after a bit they figure out, wait, this park value has gone down a bit. And then they just move out, and then you're stuck with a brown building that it used to be a nice high wealth residence. And it's not always a bad thing. I guess it's still housing medium wealth or low wealth residents, but yeah, depending on your taste, I guess. I don't really like the way they look. Yeah, I don't really like the way they look. I guess there's some mods for that. I think I've seen some mods. But yeah, I guess you could just consider using some mods. But I would avoid placing too much parks in areas that can't really support high wealth stuff in terms of desirability. So what influences desirability? I think it's mainly low crime. For high wealth residents, low pollution, low crime, low traffic noise, stuff like that. You can figure it out. I guess there's probably a guide somewhere about desirability. Alright, no parks. Alright, next point. I think an important point that I tend to forget when I start a city is to manage your budgets. Of course, I've talked about the power budget, but there's also the taxes, and yeah, I tend to forget to set the taxes right. In this video, I think I am gonna end up doing that at the end, but the best way to do it is to just pause the game before you start building. Set the taxes, so when you raise the taxes or lower the taxes, it instantly affects the game, because no residents are in the game yet, so nobody's used to different taxes yet. How to manage your taxes though? At the start of the game, I think you can get by with some pretty high taxes. Of course, at some degree of tax rate, some people are gonna dislike that, and it's gonna discourage people from moving into your city. How does that work though? There's like this thing called a neutral tax rate, and the tax rate is neutral at the start of the game. I think it's neutral at 9%. So when you tax like 1% or 1.5% above that, it starts to be negative, and below that it starts to be positive. Now, what does that positivity and negativity actually influence? It influences the demand, I believe. So the RCI thing in the bottom left there, you can see those 3 bars that are showing like how many people are looking to move into your city, I think. People, industries and stuff like that. And whenever you have a surplus of demand, I think it's alright to increase the taxes a bit for that group, because unless of course you're planning to do a big expansion in that general area. So for instance, if you have like a ton of commercial demand, but you're not really planning to expand the commercial too much, then you can always consider increasing the taxes a bit, but always be careful, because whenever you increase your taxes, it has like a more negative effect on the growth than the lower taxes, right? And the more negative effect actually lasts for a while after you lower the taxes. The higher tax rate stays around, or the influence of it stays around for like a year or 9 months or something like that. So whenever you're playing around with taxes, I always I don't know how to say taxes without it sounding like the American state Texas. Taxes. I guess it's just meant to sound similar. I don't know. So when you're playing around with taxes, do keep in mind that you might be, especially when you're gonna be raising taxes, don't do it in big super steps, right? I wouldn't do it in bigger steps than 0.5%, because if it ends up completely stumping your growth, it might also cause people to move out of your city, because those people still have to pay the taxes, and they might think, well, it's not really worth living in this city if they're gonna ask so much in terms of tax income. So be careful with your taxes. And another thing about taxes that I didn't know when I was growing up was that whenever you are growing your city, at some points, for instance, when you reach like 15,000 population, the neutral tax rate actually reduces. So 15,000 is a pretty big city already. You're not really talking about towns. Well, you're still talking about a town, I guess. But yeah, the neutral tax rate actually goes down by 0.1%. That means that as your city grows, you can just Google neutral tax rate, right? And there's gonna be like somewhere on Simtropolis, there's like a bit of a forum post, I guess is what you could call it, and it shows all the different neutral tax rates. Yeah, here you can see me set the taxes. But as your city grows, you should keep an eye on that, especially if it gets pretty big, because it might stop you from growing if you don't adjust the taxes. And you can use the census repository kind of buildings to see what the current neutral tax rate is. I guess you could Google that as well. If you don't know what it is, then just ask, I'll give you a link. I'm not really gonna be doing links in the description. Anyways, I think that's my tips. The taxes, yeah, don't put it too high and take small steps. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'd like to see you again. Goodbye.